Good afternoon. In my Bible study class on a Friday morning, we've been looking at the life of King David. And I found this really, really difficult. And I found looking at Samuel, 2 Samuel, really difficult because there it describes a lot of things to do with King David. So I did one of the last talks to wrap up the lesson there. And I entitled it, Who is David? Now, I found this lesson a real challenge. And in fact, I found the whole of the study of David a real challenge. And I caught myself asking again and again over the last couple of weeks, whilst I was trying to get a handle on these chapters, who exactly was King David? What kind of a man is behind the events that we've been studying? And here I offer you my thoughts on the questions I asked myself. I asked myself three questions. Number one, how did David become such a fearless, brilliant, gallant military general, a strategist, so much so that he could plan a battle for Joab and his general and not be there himself? And where did he gain this knowledge? And question number two, how come, supposedly being a man after God's own heart, did he have such a dysfunctional family? Because he did, a very dysfunctional family. And number three, how come he was such an outstanding statesman of such great diplomacy? And I'll attempt to address each of these questions in turn. Now, question number one, David learned how to be a general, a strategist, and a leader on the lonely hills and desert places in God's equivalent of Sandhurst and the SAS training headquarters. David knew every inch of the terrain of Israel, and he knew every inch of his kingdom and beyond his kingdom, because he'd gone over it again and again in his days as a shepherd, and in his days as one of Saul's mighty warriors, and in his days as a fugitive from Saul, and in his days as a bandit chief when he took refuge with Saul's enemies, the Philistines. He knew all the safe places to hide. He knew where the springs bubbled their pure water. He knew every tree in every wood, and he knew every city and fortified village. He had carefully studied their layout. It was almost as if he carried a living map of his kingdom and beyond in his head, which shows what an intelligent man he was. Now, I can only compare his popularity amongst his men to the popularity that Prince Harry has with the military. You talk to any soldier and they will tell you, Harry, he's one of us. No frills with Harry. He's a soldier. He's with us. Not Prince Harry, but Harry the soldier, Harry the man, Harry the comrade in arms, who is not afraid to fly his Apache helicopter into the thick of battle, nor be alongside his men on the ground. That is what these men relate to. And it was the same with David. Ask any of his men, and they would say, King David? Oh, no, not to us. He's not King David. He is David. He is one of us. He was a very skilled leader of men. He inspired the loyalty of his men. He loved them, and they loved him back. He slept with them under the stars. He tramped long, weary miles with them and crisscrossed the land of Israel and beyond. He fought alongside them in battle. He bound up their wounds with oil, just as he had bound up the wounds of his sheep with oil when he was a shepherd boy, and his soldiers bound up his. They were fiercely loyal to him. He was their comrade in arms. They would die for him, and they knew that he would die for them if the need arose. He was their beloved commander-in-chief. They admired him not only because he was a brilliant strategist, but he was not so full of himself that he relied solely on his own knowledge. He was prepared to listen to the advice of others, but especially he was prepared to listen to God. God, David, and the men that followed him were an invincible team on the battlefield. David's time with the sheep had taught him patience, responsibility, and other things. We in the West live under the delusion that the shepherds were an uncouth and despised lot. This is certainly not true in the areas of the world similar to the land of Israel where I have been and where I have lived. In these places, the shepherd is the most trustworthy person in the village. He is usually a trusted member of your family. He lives his life with the village flocks and his dog. Yes, the shepherds have dogs in these wild places, and they always have had. His relatives, the villagers, take him food and they look after his temporal needs. He is, in fact, the most important man in the village next to the chief, because he looks after the welfare of their sheep, and the sheep are their wealth. He is, in fact, the village banker. Now, David's father entrusted his youngest boy to look after the family's wealth, and he possibly looked after the wealth of his uncles and aunts as well, who all made up the inhabitants of Bethlehem. This was a massively huge responsibility for such a young boy of 15. And in his learning to look after sheep, David learned how to look after his men. By tramping the hills and valleys, he carried a map of the terrain in his head. By finding silly sheep that had strayed off, he found safe places to hide when he and his men were being harried by Saul. He learned how to use a slingshot, evidently one of the weapons employed by the army in war. He learned how to track a bear and a lion and how to kill them with his bare hands. There, in the rough terrain, God had him in training as a commando, an SAS man, ruthless and cunning, yet wholly devoted to his God. We do not read of David ever failing to consult God first when it came to battle. Out there in the vast countryside, David learned to talk to God and depend on him. He learned patience and dependence on God for all things apart from one. And here we come to my second question. How come he had such a dysfunctional family life? Now, King David had an Achilles heel, and that was the fair of sex, because after the loss of Merab and Michal, who he appears to have loved, even to risking his life to procure their dowries. For Merab, he killed Goliath. And for Michal, he had to do the grisly task of collecting so many foreskins from the Philistines, who he appears to have loved them, even to risking his life to procure their dowries. And it seems that after the loss of Michal, who refused to go with him into exile, but preferred to stay in her father's court, that David turned off the tap of love and he turned on the tap of lust. And it would appear in the matters of the heart, or in this case the lustful eye, that David was not prepared to let God have control. This area of his life was his, nothing to do with God, and he would do what the heck he liked. And it was a result of his waywardness in the matter of his sexual appetite that led to a very dysfunctional family. He married numerous women, but he did not share his God with them. He called for them when he needed sexual gratification. Every other king around him had a harem. Why shouldn't he? He allowed his wives to continue to worship their gods and have their gods' images about the place. As a result, these women taught David's offspring to follow false gods, not the true God. In fact, apart from Solomon, it would appear that David did not really have much to do with the upbringing of any of his children. He was not a good example to his children, and not a good example to his many wives and his concubines. His treatment of the concubines he left behind when he fled Jerusalem is case in point. On his return, he cruelly condemned them to a convent-like life. He could deal with his men, but his children, and it seems his wives, he could not. He loved them, but they were a constant headache. He was not a good father. He failed to teach them the ways of the Lord that he himself knew so well. His beautiful boy, Absalom, usurped his throne. But Absalom was not the leader David was. He was not a warrior. He did not know the wild terrain like David knew it. David had failed to take him out and teach him the tactics of guerrilla warfare. He had failed to take him into battle with him. He'd failed to train any of his sons how to be a king, a warrior, and above all, a leader and a strategist. It was David who planned the battle in which Absalom was killed. He could have gone to battle himself, but he chose to stay behind. How can a father face his son in battle? Then came the news that Absalom had been killed, and David fell into deep mourning for his very wayward boy. Perhaps he recognized in Absalom his own waywardness in that one area of his own life. He was so intent on mourning his son that he forgot that others were mourning the loss of their sons. He forgot to go out and congratulate his men on their victory. The victory he had planned and they had achieved by following his strategy. His men were perplexed and deeply hurt. The grapevine spread the news to crusty old General Joab. He was having none of it, and he went to confront the king. No bowing and scraping here. Joab told it exactly how it was, and he shocked David into going out to the gate of the city and greeting his battle-weary men. As Joab had said, he needed to boost their morale. This David did, but from that time on, he bore a grudge against his brother in arms, his trusted general, his nephew. He let personal stuff come between them. But Joab was still loyal to his king, and even voluntarily went into battle under his own brother's command. Joab thumbed his nose at the demotion by David and eventually regained his position by killing his replacement. Joab was very swift to deal with insurrection in the quickest way imaginable. His shrewd bargaining with the wise woman of Abel gave him the traitor Sheba's head without loss of life other than Sheba's own. Joab was always loyal to his king. He gained great victories for David on the field of battle, especially when David, unable to be with his men at that time, was trying to piece the kingdom back together. Number 3, how did David demonstrate he was an outstanding statesman of great diplomacy? Now, David nearly lost everything when he put his own personal grief for his son before the welfare of his men and his country. Joab's words had startled him into action. And at this point in the story, David stood at the crossroads. His whole future and that of his country and nation were in great jeopardy. Blunt Joab was right in his perception of the mood of the people. If they saw that David had lost the will and capacity to lead them with courage and command with strength, then the whole of the nation would disintegrate into separate tribes. David needed to use all his wisdom and diplomacy to try and mend the nation. Patiently, he had to stitch the tribes and clans together to try to form one nation again. It was a very difficult job, as old rivalries and grudges ran deep. The nation needed him to reunite them. And I don't think that anyone realized the deep inner spiritual struggle David was having at that time, a struggle that was eating at his very soul, and he must have been shouting out to God, "Why, God? Why? Why me? Why Absalom? Why did Joab disobey my orders and kill the boy, my own nephew? How come he killed his cousin?" He knew that all the people wanted was a hero that could lead them into battle and power as a nation. Before the Absalom insurrection, David had been all these to his people. Now he had to put aside his personal grief and personal things and get his country back on an even keel. And in order to do that, he would need all his powers of persuasion and diplomacy. Now, the tribes of Israel were the first to make overtures for the return of the king. But Judah, his own tribe, seemed to be reluctant in coming forwards. Now, this puzzled David, and in a clever diplomatic move, in order to gain their support, he informed them that, number 1, the tribes of Israel had beaten them to it and had already asked him to return as their king. Number 2, he reminded them that he was family. He was blood of their blood, bone of their bone. Number 3, Amasa, the commander of Absalom's armies, would replace Joab and become commander-in-chief. David then dispensed forgiveness to Shimei and the foxy Ziba. Both had insulted him. Now here they were, grovelling at his feet. David forgave, but he did not forgive. He did not forget. His grudges ran very deep, and he left it up to Solomon to sort out and punish these men when he himself had died. It took all of David's diplomacy to bring that nation together. They were very tribal and very clannish, and I can only compare the situation David faced to the problems in Ireland when that country was split in two, or to the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, the dreadful conflict in the Congo, the terrible conflict in Nigeria, and also any other conflict that you look at. Now, if you dig deep, most conflicts in this world are either tribal, racial, or religious in origin. And we now come to the famine and David's handling of that affair. At first, with my Western mind, I recoiled from the cruelty of the act. How could David do this? Crucifixion, yes, crucifixion of those young men, sons and grandsons of Saul, dying a cruel and very slow death. Then their bodies just hanging there, decomposing for up to 6 months, all the time fiercely protected from the scavengers by the mother of two of the boys. The root of this problem had been Saul's slaughter of the Gibeonites, very people who had made a treaty with Joshua and had become servants to the tabernacle, providing the priests with water and wood. They knew their rights under Levitical law, and they asked for recompense from the perpetrator of the crime against them. And as Saul was dead, his immediate family had to pay the price, lives for lives. David granted them their request. Then, in order to placate the tribe of Saul, he gives them a royal burial along with the bones of Saul and Jonathan in the tomb of Saul's father Kish. And thinking about this, I suddenly realized that David did 2 things and he came to third. Number 1, he paid the blood debt to the Gibeonites. The nation of Israel could not argue with that because it was laid down in Levitical law. Number 2, he then placated the tribe of Israel by giving the boys a royal burial. And what's more, he brought back the bones of Saul and Jonathan and Saul's other sons and buried them along with the boys in their ancestral tomb. So this resulted in the famine being lifted and the nation having food once more. But the famine did not lift until David had buried the bones and the bodies in the tomb. I think that's very significant. It did not lift until he had done that. Then David, aged 60, went into battle against the Philistines once more, this time alongside his men, and this time he nearly got killed. If it hadn't been for the quick thinking of Abishai, David, the light of Israel and the hope of the nation, would have died that day on the battlefield. His men refused to allow him to go to war again. Now, his chief concern in his old age was the spiritual state of his nation. He knew that they needed to grow spiritually, and he realized that if the people truly honored God, then he would honor them by lifting them up above the heathen nations that surrounded them. He discerned that he had been chosen and anointed for service by God. He'd been called to be a king, a shepherd, a writer of poems and songs, a priest, and a prophet. And in his heart, David determined that he would not neglect those talents that God had entrusted him with. And for the rest of his days, he carefully set out to establish his nation as a nation that followed the true God. So who was David, and what are the secrets of his success? And here I paraphrase Philip Keller, the writer of David the Shepherd King. Number 1, David was not perfect. He was not a saint with a halo around his head. He was a passionate man with lights and shadows in his character, but he was a man totally available to God and God's purposes. 2, David had a humble and a contrite spirit and was totally sensitive to God's spirit. The Bible uses the phrase broken heart, and in biblical terms, this means a will that has been trained and disciplined to do the will of God. I can only compare it to a horse being broken to the saddle or a donkey broken to bear burdens. David's life, especially in his later years, was a life of self-sacrifice. Number 3, David had a remarkable capacity for repentance. He knew his personal responsibilities and he took the necessary steps to put things right with God and with man. God can work with people like David. Number 4, he was a very gifted person, but he did not use those gifts for his own aggrandizement. He used them for the blessing of others and the honor of his God. And in conclusion, I would like to use the actual words of Philip Keller, who describes David thus. David's glory did not lie either in his gifts as a man, nor in his genius as a leader. His splendor lay in his willingness to be a servant to his people and to his God. He was in essence a living example of the magnificent grace of God, active in the life of a man available to the purposes of the Most High. Well, I hope that's made you think. It certainly made me think. And as I said, I had quite a struggle with it, trying to understand it. Okay, then, take care. Bye.